I want to share with you 9 things that you want to avoid when moving to the country. 9 different situations or things that you don't want to have your house by if you move to a country property. Hey everybody, Chad Cruiser here with Health and Homestead. And if you end up liking this video, you want to learn more about homesteading, living in the country, growing your own food, hit the subscribe button. And the first thing we're talking about that you might want to avoid is moving by a nuclear power plant. So just last week we were looking for some property for some people that are close to us, and it was out in the country, beautiful property, 22 acres I believe it was, but it was relatively close to a nuclear power plant. Now, the chances that something like that is going to melt down is very unlikely, but you remember back in 2011 at the Fukushima nuclear power plant there in Japan, when there was a tsunami because of an earthquake, you ended up having that thing, it had a meltdown, and for years to come, they're gonna have trouble in that area. So moving near a nuclear power plant, in general, very unlikely anything's gonna happen. But since we were just looking at a very nice looking piece of property, but the fact that it was close to a nuclear power plant gave me the sense, hey, this is not an area I'd want to live. So number 1, avoid living by nuclear power plants. Number 2, the second one is it might be wise not to live by one of the branches of the armed services, being next to some kind of military installment. It's very unlikely that something bad would happen, but if we were ever at war, being right next to a place like that could be an extra danger point to live by one of these installments, especially during a war. So I would consider, unless, hey, if you're in one of the armed services, then it actually might work out very well for you to live near there. But for the rest of us, it might be wise not to. Number 3, the third thing to think about is you don't want to move into a crime-ridden region. And you might be thinking, hey, that's one of the reasons I'm looking to move to the country, so that there isn't all kinds of crime around me. Isn't just moving to the country by default going to have less crime? Now, often that's going to be the case, but there are certain situations, there are certain localities, even in the deep country. You may know that certain drugs like meth, people kind of think of that as a rural drug, and there are areas that are just riddled with these kind of problems. So if you're looking for safety, if you're looking for peace in the country, you don't want to move to an area that's known for heavy drug usage or crime. And so these are kind of things, sometimes you can look up the literal statistics of a county, and that can give you a better idea of what are the crime rates like for the community that I'm considering moving into. Number 4 is it would be wise in general not to move in an area that has real water troubles. There are actually certain portions of the country that, like certain parts of Nebraska, where you cannot drill any new wells, I've been told. And so being in an area like that, it would be fine to be there if you can find a property with an already established well. But if not, buying land there would be kind of useless. And so you'd have the land, but you may not be able to put any water on it. You'd have to have the water brought in from an outside source, and I am thoroughly not interested in that. And I just don't think it's wise, especially during difficult times, to depend upon your water in that situation on a total outside source. On top of that, there are areas that are just known for them drilling and hitting either some kind of cave or just not hitting water, and so you probably don't want to move to an area that's known for not having enough water. So you can either talk to the neighbors in the area that you're in, find out how deep the wells are, find out how the water is in that particular region, but you want to avoid in general areas where water is somehow not accessible. Let's go on to number 5. The 5th thing is kind of the opposite of the last one. The last one was about too little water. You don't want to move to a property that is in a flood zone. The good news is if you find a property that has a part of it in a flood zone, if it's a large enough property, it has part of it that's not in the flood zone, you could potentially buy that property as long as you make sure to put your house on the portion of the property that is not in the flood zone. So you really don't want to do that. I've talked about this in a former video, that they have these incredible sales of, wow, this property is super cheap and it's on a 100-year floodplain, and it's so unlikely to happen anytime soon. Well, sometimes the unlikely thing happens twice in a year, and so you just don't want to be in a floodplain. That's not where you want to be. So make sure you're well up on high ground. Typically, you can actually find these things. You can find the maps that will show where the flood zones are, and you can make sure you have a property that is high enough. So avoid being on a flood zone. And number 6, the 6th thing you want to avoid is, well, first of all, you want to make sure that the property that you're buying, that you have legal access to the property. Now, what do I mean? To give you a little illustration, a friend of mine bought an extremely cheap piece of land, a piece of property, and when he went to go see it, and I think he had bought it before he even looked at it, when he went to go see it, he found out that there was no legal access to the property. The property was actually what we call landlocked. So what that means is there were other private properties around that property, and this property was behind it. And so you actually had no way to get to it. Now, sometimes you can pay a neighbor to give you an easement, a legal deeded easement, so that you can actually access the property. But you don't want to do that. You don't want to go buying a piece of property without that legal access, because you never know if you can get it. And if you can't get to it, well, then you can't get to it. You can't even get to your own property. So you need to make sure some places, some locales actually make it so that you have to be able to have access to your property or your ground, but there are other areas that don't, and so you want to make sure never buy a property that you don't have access to. Now, secondarily, right on that same subject, there are situations where you can buy property like in a national forest. Some people are willing to do that. They're not worried about eminent domain, that they'll get the property taken away from them. But you have to make sure, even in those situations, even if there's like a forestry service road that goes right by and you say, oh, I could just drive right up to my property. But you need to make sure that you have legal access, that you are allowed 100% of the time to be able to make it out to your property, or you might get stuck with land that you have no access to. Now, a 7th thing you might want to avoid is being next to a toxic waste dump or a landfill. And you may think, oh, that's obvious. I have a friend that actually their family had bought land. I don't know if they knew it at the time, but they bought land directly next to some kind of toxic waste dump. And so when you were driving in their driveway to their property, there was a sign right there that said toxic waste. And the entire family had mental and psychological problems. And I am quite convinced that this must be the reason why, that each one of them suffered with these issues. And I'm not saying that it would only be for mental health issues, but for multiple reasons. Obviously, there's your physical health, there's your mental health, and then there's also the resale value. Being next to a dump is not the best kind of place, or a toxic landfill or something like this. Being next to these things, there's really just absolutely no benefit, except for you're getting some cheap property because you're in the vicinity. But the problem is then when you sell it, it's also going to be a very low value to somebody else. And so I say this one, be very careful. If you see something like this, just avoid it at all costs. There's no good reason to be next to a landfill or some kind of toxic waste dump. Now, the second to the last one, the 8th point that you want to avoid, is being next to large electrical towers, or these massive power grid stations. Being next to these, number one, it lowers the value of your property. So yes, you can get cheaper property in an area like that, but you're also being given this EMF radiation potentially. And hey, many are going to claim it's perfectly all right to be by these, and others are going to say, no, it's not the case. But it's the kind of thing where it lowers the property value. It potentially has negative side effects to your body. And so as a result, that's kind of one of the things that you might want to avoid. Now, number 9 fits right along with this, and I've mentioned these two in another video, is to avoid being near large cell phone towers and these kinds of things. Same thing, lowers the property value, but it also is potentially exhibiting, from a long distance. For the rest of us, it's probably not causing, hopefully, too much damage, because there's EMF waves that are almost everywhere. But being very close to these, they actually have warning signs on them, because getting too close to them is dangerous. And being around them all day, every day, or at least all night as you sleep and all the time while you're home, this might be detrimental to your health. So this is the 9th thing that I would consider avoiding if you're looking to buying a country property. Hey, and by the way, if you would like to see 3 mistakes that I made in moving to the country, you're gonna wanna click right here. I made a whole video on 3 major mistakes that I made in moving to the country. So click right there, and if you like this video, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, and share this video with your friends. God bless and have a fantastic day.